So welcome to this panel here in the audience and everybody who follows us online. My name is Florian Eder. I'm a journalist for and with Politico, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. And it is my pleasure to introduce the person that you actually want to hear from, which is not me, but Creon Butler, who is a director of the Global Economic and Finance Program at Chatham House. And he joined from the Cabinet Office after a distinguished career in the civil service that brought him to help design the 2014 sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Crimea. So there could not be a better person to talk to about the theme of this issue, the future of sanctions. I would propose that before we talk about the future of sanctions, Creon, we look at where we're at. So this morning the European Union officially agreed on the fifth package of sanctions against Russia. Some more banks included, some more transport, some more sectors like transport included. Maybe a very general question, if the general aim of sanction is to harm the target but to minimize the self-harm, what do you make of the effort so far to sanction Russia over the war against Ukraine?
Well, I think what we have seen is completely unprecedented in terms of the total package of sanctions. And I think this just reflects the nature of the Russian attack on Ukraine, a completely unprovoked attack on Ukraine, and really something that calls into question the whole international architecture put in place after the Second World War. And that is probably the most important reason why this package is so distinct and so different. There are other reasons, one of which is the way in which the Ukrainians have resisted and bought time, the fact that the private sector has actually amplified in many ways things that the public sector is doing. And there's a question why that is the case. It may partly be, if you like, the fear of, by dealing with a Russian entity, that you somehow got on the wrong side of the US Justice Department. But I also think there's an element, a consequence of the ESG movement and the fact that companies just don't feel right doing certain things that might have been the case in the past. It's also the alignment with the transition to net zero and the fact that some of the things that need to be done quickly were things that needed to be done anyway. The package has kind of three main elements. One is excluding Russia from the international financial system, the most important bit of which is the ban on transactions with the Russian central bank. And that had only really been applied in a very small number of cases, never to a country of this size, member of the G20, and I think it's probably it is the most significant element. There's also this.
It's also a measure that actually so it was applied to North Korea, Iran, countries like that. So there is it leaves a clear mark on them. Is that part of the strategy here also?
Well, I think, as I say, that Russia is a far bigger economy than any of those economies were when it was applied, and the consequence has been a ripple effect across the entire financial system. So I think, although it has been applied before, never in these circumstances. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, there are all kinds of private sector transactions that couldn't take place. It's quite possible that Russia will default on its Eurobond debt, essentially because although it may have the dollars in principle to pay, it just can't do that transaction and so on. So I think that is really powerful. There are two other elements. One is the step up of action against Russian kleptocrats abroad, which is much more intense, more comprehensive. And then the third, which I think is really important, is a set of measures against restricting Russia's access to international markets for goods and services, both in terms of Russia's ability to sell to those markets, and we can see in terms of the energy transactions and today's decision in the EU to move forward with a ban on coal, but then also the fact that, for example, Boeing and Airbus are not supplying parts for Russian aircraft for aircraft to the Russian fleets, and 75% of Russia's fleet is Boeing and Airbus aircraft. So these are really quite significant things.
If I ask you to rank these individual pillars of the sanctions package in terms of impact, what's the single most powerful thing? Is it the central banking?
Yes, I think more than anything else, that is the most powerful. But I think, we're seeing on the trade side an accumulating set of transactions and of actions. And for example, the the decision by the US to remove most favored nation status from Russia is an example of how that can go quite a bit further, I think. I think if you look at how sanctions may develop in the future, I mean, there's a really important point which is around the supply chain for the Russian military complex, how they put together weapons in order to use them in Ukraine. And I think that is an area that you will see the West target quite actively. And if there's going to be anywhere that you see secondary sanctions applied, it may well be in relation to the supply chains for the Russian military complex. I mean, more broadly, I don't think secondary sanctions are something that is necessary in a sense, but on that specific area, it may be something that you see in the future.
I'd like to come to the longer-term perspective on this in a minute. Just coming back to the actual program, it seems as if Russia has shaken off the first effect, the first impact, quite easily. Is that what does it tell you in terms of are these sanctions, working? Well,
I mean, the Russian authorities put in place 20% interest rates, capital controls. I mean, nobody has, I think, really put forward a kind of clear forecast. But I mean, there are forecasts that suggest the fall in Russian GDP will be 15% this year. So this is a massive fact, even though, as you say, the ruble has recovered its ground. But I don't think that in any way is an indicative sign that Russia somehow escaped this. But I think the really important thing is the long-term effect. I mean, by long-term, I mean 1 to 2 years out or further. If you look at the Russian energy sector, it's being hit on both the supply side with, for example, Germany saying that they're going to stop importing oil from Russia in the course of this year and then eliminate their imports of gas from Russia in the course of next year. So, and there are many other countries doing the same. So that on the supply side, where's Russia going to sell its gas in the future? On the demand side, there's no access, there will be restricted access to finance and also no access to the kind of technologies needed to develop the very kind of complex energy sources that Russia has. So if you look into the longer term, it doesn't look good either. And in a sense, as the period extends, it seems to get worse. I think one other thing I'd make is if you look at the repressive measures the Russian president has introduced, this is also leading to a brain drain in Russia, and therefore, if you look at the longer-term potential for the economy, it doesn't look good either in that respect.
There's actually, to a difference between these different single sets of sanctions, because what you just described and what we see is, other economies turning away from Russia as a supplier of gas and oil and forms of energy. That is actually not a short-term or time restricted action. It's actually turning away so that Russia is losing its market. Is that a correct observation?
Well, I mean, for gas in particular, in the short term, there's really nowhere else that it can sell other than through the pipelines that go to Europe. I mean, in the longer term, potentially you can build new pipelines, but then we have this other element, which is net zero, and the fact that the market for gas is only limited in any case. So, in that sense, this is why these two things combine together, I think, to make a very powerful response.
We often hear as a motive for sanctioning kleptocrats, as you call them, oligarchs, that people have to be unhappy enough with the regime and with Putin, so that they might even defect or do more radical things. Is that actually an element, or is that are these sanctions more of a symbol to show people that everybody is actually hit and not just the ordinary Russian?
So I think my view is of the three elements, this is the less important one exactly for the reason that clearly they are important parts of the Russian political economic system, but I don't think that this is going to be a critical determinant of Russia's future policy, President Putin's future policy. But it is symbolic. I mean, it's really significant and symbolic. And in a sense, particularly for my own country, this is something where there's been quite a radical change of view as a consequence of what we've seen.
There were sanctions this morning against Putin's daughter and the one of his foreign minister. How does that? What is the symbolism of this?
Well, I think the logic is people who are supporting the current Russian regime, whether implicitly or explicitly, And the argument is that people who are doing that should not be able to enjoy the benefits of living life prosperity in the West. So I think that is the logic. It's to say anybody who is complicit in what Russia is currently doing should not benefit from the lifestyle that they've had in the past. And I think that's the logic that underlies these steps. I mean, it can also be that some of these, because they're extremely wealthy people, they're important investors in Russia, and to the extent that their assets are frozen, this also limits the supply of funds into Russia. So it's not completely insignificant in that case, but I would put it as a less important thing than the other two measures.
Now, we talked about the sanctions in place, and you said that this is a very significant package, and it's quite different from last time that sanctions were imposed. So what does that tell us for the ability to escalate from the West side, actually? I think a lot of analysts and analysts are expecting this war to endure and to not be over very soon. So what do we do next time is the short question. There are cruelties and massacres like we saw last week.
I mean, I think the key thing is that the existing package is sustained and then strengthened and deepened in a number of areas. As I say, the supply chain issues, I think, could be potentially very important. I don't think on its own that sanctions can produce a change of course from the Russian government, but I think combined with the military support, and I think there's reporting today of, in a sense, the extent to which the West is providing the Ukrainian army with enough anti-aircraft missiles and so on in order to provide its own sort of no-fly zone, which I think is, in a sense, a logical way to go. And then alongside that, there's also the support that the West, and particularly the European Union, provides to Ukraine, both in terms of immediate financial support, but also a path to the future that they want. And on the question of Ukraine's application for European Union membership, I mean, I think that clearly there are other people in the queue, and there's a number of important issues there, but it's although it would be very expensive, I think it is potentially a very strong asset for the EU in the long term. So I would, as I think Tony Blair said earlier, be in favour of providing Ukraine with a path to EU membership. And I think that in time that would produce a very major asset for the European Union in terms of the market prosperity. It has enormous human capital, it has enormous mineral resources, agricultural resources, and so on. And those three things together give Ukraine a kind of a future. And then I think on the other side, looking at that, at some point the Russian government will say, well, why do we continue given that we can't change this kind of overall package?
So you're on the spectrum that we've seen over the course of the past days, more on the, not more, very much on the optimistic side of
I wouldn't say, I mean, there are clearly really significant risks in this, but I don't think you can tackle, you can't tackle this without taking risks. But unlike, I think, some who've argued that there's really no chance this will work, I definitely am not in that position. I think it's a logical, rational strategy, and there is a reasonably good chance that this will work in terms of preserving Ukrainian democracy, preserving and Ukraine's ability to stay part of Western liberal democracies. What it will mean for Russia in the long term, who knows? I mean, that depends in a sense how it plays out.
One last question on sanctions as such. There's pressure mounting on Germany and others in the European Union. We understand that Prime Minister Johnson will, kind of sing the same song today when Chancellor Scholz is in London to see him for the first time since he took office. To tell Germany and others like Austria that they that they should embargo, they should introduce a ban on Russian energy, first of all completely, and then as soon as possible. Now, you didn't mention that explicitly. Is it because you think it's not as important as the other things that you mentioned?
No, I think it's really important, but equally, as you highlighted at the start, one can't sort of be completely oblivious for the costs to those countries that are imposing the sanctions. And clearly, if you were to do it tomorrow, this would be a very high cost, very, very high cost for those countries that are currently dependent on gas. But I think they've signaled very clearly, in what in normal terms is a very short space of time, that Russia's market in Europe has ended. And obviously, if that can be accelerated, that's great. But but I think that, to me, is a sufficient signal. And, markets, politicians, others look forward and they can see what's happening. So I think the signal is very clear of where this is going.
When we talk about the broader impact of this crisis, of this war, on global affairs, to be as narrow as that, what is your? You mentioned before the international financial and economic, the financial system. First of all, is there an impact beyond this crisis? Question mark.
Well, I think so, because other authoritarian regimes looking at the way the West has deployed sanctions, in this case, will be asking themselves, what does it mean for us in the future? One thing to remember is the threshold was a very, very high threshold. So, I can't imagine that the scale of sanctions, the degree of coordination and so on being applied in circumstances that don't match what happened this time. But yeah, I think there is going to be a lot of thinking around the world as to what does this mean. It clearly strengthens the West, I think, in general, because they've demonstrated they have this tool. I used to think certainly about applying, for example, the dollar clearing system as a sanction. I used to think about it in terms of, well, it's something you should threaten but not actually do, because if you do it, people will figure out how to get around it. But I think what this has shown is that the only convertible currencies available are currencies that are provided by the liberal democracies. If it's not the dollar or the euro, it's the Canadian dollar or the New Zealand dollar, whatever. And there is no substitute for that. China at one point seemed to be quite close to removing capital controls to making its currency convertible. It didn't. So this is and you can't really have effective foreign exchange reserves without having a large chunk of convertible currencies. So in a way, I think this has demonstrated a very powerful tool for the West. Obviously, they need to apply it sensibly and not abuse it. And there are people who are thinking about what kind of rules there should be for this in the future. But I think that is a really important and significant element for
that makes also marks a clear difference from, let's say, the governance of the international community. No, if you can imply sanctions, but Russia has still a veto power. That's what I'm referring to in the Security Council.
Yeah, I think this is a really key difference on the security side and the security architecture that was created after the Second World War. Russia has a veto. And that's really problematic, as many people have said. On the economic side, there is no equivalent, even in the international financial institution. So if Russia ever needed, if Russia was thinking about how can I get support from the IMF or the World Bank in circumstances where other countries, including Ukraine currently, is seeking, it's just impossible because the way those institutions are structured, the US and the other Western countries have a veto over that kind of financial support. So I think there is a dramatic, really important difference between the two fields.
I have one last question as we're wrapping up slowly. The West has been very united over this past few weeks. What is your assessment of how long this will hold? Because it is, of course, a symmetric shock for now, but it has an asymmetric impact, if you wish, because the map of energy suppliers and net energy exporters is redrawn at the very moment. So what's your take on how long the unity in the West will hold?
So in the short term, it goes back to your point about one of the reasons the sanctions package was very strong was it was also very carefully judged. So, and this is why I think calls for countries that are very dependent on that gas to stop importing immediately, it's probably not a wise way to go, because it removes that sort of recognition that countries are in a different place. And I think as long as that continues in how sanctions are applied, so that when the G7 and other countries get together, they not only think about what's effective, but also what the costs are. I think it will continue, and I think as long as Russian troops remain in Ukraine, it's very hard to see how this could be unwound, and impossible as far as I can see. And then in the long term, again, you have the climate change thing, which will take the entire issue of dependence on gas and so on away. And that, I think, is a big difference from situations like this in the past. So the short term, yes, provided there's wisdom, it will continue. The long term, the response to climate change will deal with the potential differences that might emerge.
Thank you very much, Creon Butler, for this crisp talk about sanctions and the future of sanctions here at Artemis Hall at the Delphi Forum. I thank you here in the audience. that you came here to listen to this panel and not to the stiff competition that we faced, including the central bank governor who was talking about the euro, which is certainly also a very interesting topic. So thank you here, thank you who followed us online, and please stay in the room for the next panel or have a coffee break. We're done here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.